Disappearing Indians. Many Latin American census reports from the mid-20th century documented the gradual disappearance of culturally distinct indigenous groups within national populations. The disappearance of Indians was parsed as an unequivocally positive development. National progress had become synonymous with modernization, and modernization by definition meant movement from the primitive past towards a more civilized future. Paradoxically, the use of censuses to track the demographic disappearance of Indians ended up accentuating their enduring and heterogeneous presence. An important consequence of the shift from race to culture as the master category for tracking difference within populations was that indigenous people gained visibility in the censuses of many Latin American countries. Census questionnaires for Andean and Mesoamerican countries, especially including a variety of queries about cultural characteristics and behavior, questions about maternal and habitual language used in the household diet, use of particular type of shoes and clothes, and household characteristics, provided an array of data that testified to the diversity of indigenous populations even as they were marshaled to document indigenous peoples' gradual absorption into national societies. For each country and decade, whether a national census was taken and whether that national census made indigenous people discernible as a distinct section of the population. A number of different types of census questions served to make indigenous people visible in Latin American censuses, including questions about customs, identity, language, group membership, and race. Whether Indio or Indigena were listed as possible options. Whether indigenous populations were made visible in censuses through these approaches, and indigenous visibility if a country took a separate indigenous census in conjunction with a national census in a given decade. For each country and decade, whether a national census included a question about indigenous customs such as dress or diet, language, or group membership. Countries took separate Indian censuses apart from national censuses, most notably Chile, Panama, and Venezuela. These segregated counts are differentiated because they made individual indigenous population statistics visible, but they did so outside the context of the national census. The statistical visibility of indigenous peoples in the second half of the 20th century was not, in itself, something new. In several Latin American countries, censuses had long classified and counted indigenous people as a distinct component of a national population. In the period from the 1810s to the 1940s, of the 85 censuses for which sufficient information on the content of the questionnaire is available, just under half, 42 out of 85, made indigenous populations statistically visible. But the specific ways that Indians were identified and classified in censuses changed in the latter part of this century, in ways that made them both more statistically visible overall and visible in more distinct ways than in censuses in the past. And the shift from race to culture as the master frame for conceptualizing, classifying, and counting indigenous populations in Latin American censuses can be seen. Prior to the 1950 census round, the majority of censuses that made indigenous people statistically visible did so exclusively through the use of direct race questions. That is, for example, a question queried raza with Indio or Indigena as a response option among others. This was the case for 21 of the 42 censuses taken prior to the 1950s in which indigenous populations were statistically visible. This does not include the cases in which available sources make clear that Indians were counted but do not provide sufficient information to code the question type. In 6 additional cases, indigenous people were made statistically visible through a direct race question in combination with another type of question, such as a query about mother tongue, or a separate indigenous enumeration conducted in conjunction with the national census. 3 of the 6 censuses that used a race question in addition to some other means of enumerating Indians took place in the 1940 census round, anticipating the broader shift toward the use of varied queries to enumerate indigenous peoples in the second half of the century. In contrast to the dominant approach before World War II, none of the countries that counted indigenous people on a census during the 1950s relied exclusively on race questions to do so. In the 1950 census round, 16 Latin American countries took national censuses, and 9 of these indigenous peoples were counted. In another 2 cases, they were counted in separate indigenous censuses. 2 countries, Bolivia and Costa Rica, retained versions of race questions to identify indigenous peoples, in addition to other types of questions. By the 1960 census round, direct race questions had together disappeared as a means to enumerate indigenous people in Latin America. In the new normative context, Latin American states identified indigenous populations on the census via questions about culture, including an array of specific inquiries into language, custom, dress, diet, and even household characteristics and composition. Census questions that targeted distinctly indigenous traits or better traits that scientists and census officials constructed as distinctively indigenous made Indians more visible in Latin American censuses. Yet a primary goal of such questions, ironically, was to generate data that would enable state officials to better track, or ideally accelerate, the disappearance of indigenous peoples through their assimilation into the general population. Conceptual and methodological shifts notwithstanding, census officials' reading of data from queries about cultural characteristics tended to reveal considerable continuity of thought with a positivist evolution of prior decades. Cultural indicators of indigeneity were often equated with the primitive past, while signs of assimilation were treated as evidence of the modern mestizo present, en route to the nation's thoroughly civilized future. A particularly striking example of the development of survey questions about cultural differences precisely to facilitate their disappearance comes from Mexico in the 1940s and 1950s. The famous anthropologist Manuel Gamio, who became director of the Mexican government's Department of Demography in the 1940s, argued that the existing questions about maternal language in Mexico's censuses should be supplemented with a battery of additional questions about cultural habits, including whether the individual eats bread or tortillas, goes barefoot in sandals or in shoes, wears indigenous style or European style pants, calzón o pantalón, or dresses envuelto en agua o vestido completo, sleeps on the floor, in a hammock, a woven mat, or a bed, the type of material of the home, adobe, simple plaster, stone, brick, wood, etc., owns a radio or a sewing machine, etc. With such data in hand, Gamio explained one could identify cultural characteristics that are purely Indian, foreign European, and mixed Indo-European, and then do an inventory of families' characteristics to identify those with the most purely Indian profiles. Official classification as Indian would be tied directly and exclusively to this inventory of cultural traits. Those with a high percentage of objects of Indian culture would thus be considered Indian for administrative purposes regardless of biological origin. These Indian families could then be targeted, Gamio reasoned, with benevolent indigenista policies that sought to eradicate inefficient, primitive, and anachronistic behaviors within the Mexican population. Statistical description of Indian traits would bolster policy prescription for their targeted elimination. In other countries as well, census officials use queries about mundane behaviors and living conditions to track the size and characteristics of indigenous populations. In the process, key indicators of development were rendered synonymous with cultural assimilation by Indians to a European mestizo way of life. In Peru, for example, the 1961 census included a variety of detailed questions that served as proxies for whether or not an individual lived as an Indian. Among the queries, what kind of floor is this home, improved or dirt? Does this person chew coca leaves? Does this person go barefoot? In an illustrative set of pie charts, those who wore proper shoes, zapatos, were distinguished from those who wore sandals, huaraches, or those who went barefoot, descalzo. What Peruvians wore on their feet intimated that the nation was composed of two basic kinds of people, those who do not wear civilized shoes, and further stratified by sex. By treating impoverished living conditions as a proxy for indigenousness, census reports reified the idea that impoverishment was a defining characteristic of being Indian. The link between low social status and classification as Indian was made explicit in the 1973 Guatemalan census. Enumerators were instructed to consider the social status of the individual to determine whom to classify as indigenous. The difficulty in formulating a precise definition of the indigenous population having been recognized by specific organizations, organismos especializados, the criteria from the 1950 census having been adopted to classify a person as indigena in the social status, estimación social, of the person, is taken into account. Recognizing that this guideline may not have always been sufficient for enumerators to make a determination, the instruction continued: if there is doubt, as a last resort, the person is to be asked if he is Ladino or indigena. Census queries about cultural characteristics generated statistics that officials gleaned as indicators of the population's level of development. These measures of development were simultaneous measures of cultural assimilation by indigenous people into the national mestizo mass. As a result, the use of cultural characteristics to track Indianness helped to solidify the strong association between the impoverished living conditions, low social status, being Indian in Latin America. In official census reports, the disappearance of indigenous people and the process of national development were often seen as one and the same dynamic. Notably, this was the case even in countries that did not collect detailed cultural information on demographic censuses. In Venezuela, for example, the 1941 census did not include questions to identify indigenous peoples. Regardless, the official census report included an estimated number of uncivilized Indians remaining in the national territory. In 1950, a separate indigenous census generated counts of wild Indians, Indios Silvestres. The first volume published results from the 1950 national census describing the method used to identify uncivilized Indians. And the findings of the special investigation of the indigenous population do not refer to the entire population that could be called indigenous on the basis of its more or less pure racial type, since without a doubt a large number of Indians are incorporated into ordinary civil life and cannot be differentiated expressly from the rest of the population. Concretely, the results refer to the indigenous population that maintains typically Indian characteristics in relation to their location, type of housing, customs, etc. By definition, culture, not race, determined who counted in Venezuela's special census of the indigenous population. The census director underscored that the investigation did not include Indians living incorporated in civil life, participating in the common regimes of life, del régimen común de vida. The only type of Indians of concern to census takers were those not yet integrated into national society. And the point of collecting information about unincorporated Indians was precisely to hasten their disappearance into the mass of the population. This impetus is captured clearly in the official report. We took advantage of the occasion to collect sanitary, economic, and cultural information that would allow description of the exact situation of the Venezuelan Indian, in order to design measures aimed at improving their conditions of life and incorporating them progressively into civilization. Thus, from the perspective of census officials, being ethno-racially distinguishable Indian and being part of civilization were mutually exclusively possibilities. The disappearance of Indians as a distinguishable type within the population figured as both an indicator of national development. Latin American censuses from the post-World War II decades portrayed assimilation as a one-way street that moved Indians away from primitive practices associated with indigenous culture and toward modern practices associated with civilized Euro-Mestizo nations. The proliferation of census queries about cultural characteristics in the latter part of the 20th century heightened the visibility of indigenous peoples within Latin American populations, but mostly with an eye-to-eye devising social policies that would hasten their absorption into the rest of the population. The modernizing aim was to make Indians disappear as a distinct type within Latin American nations. Disappeared blacks. In stark contrast to the increased statistical visibility of indigenous peoples in Latin America censuses following World War I, Afro-descendant populations were eclipsed from view in national censuses throughout most of the region. Few countries retained direct race or color questions on national censuses after the 1940s, and the use of cultural questions as a substitute did not typically capture behaviors or traits that differentiating Afro-descendants from others within national populations. National censuses taken by Latin American countries from the 1810s to the 1910s, in which Afro-descendant individuals are statistically visible as a distinct population component of national populations. General trends in the enumeration of Afro-descendant populations in Latin American census in the 20th century, like a few anomalous cases. Looking first at temporal trends, it is evident that Afro-descendant individuals were not identified in the majority of 19th century censuses conducted in Latin America. They became more visible in censuses taken in the early part of the 20th century, especially from the 1920s to the 1940s, for reasons analyzed in the previous chapters. Between the 1940s and the 1960s, Afro-descendants all but disappeared from Latin American censuses. In the 1940 census round, more than 50% of Latin American countries that took a census, 6 out of 11, made Afro-descendants statistically visible. In the 1950 census round, the proportion of states that counted Afro-descendants on the census declined to 1/4, 4 out of 16. By the 1960 census round, only 2 countries included a question on their national census that enabled identification of Afro-descendants as a distinct subset of the population. In the second half of the 20th century, Afro-descendants were again invisible in official statistics in most countries in the region. Cross-cutting the temporal trends, the propensity to include questions about race or color on a national census is tied to differences in the demographic histories associated with distinct regions of Latin America. Southern cone countries with a relatively small African descendant population routinely made them invisible in national censuses. Andean and Mesoamerican countries often identified Afro-descendant populations on at least one early 20th century census, but not thereafter. In Atlantic Rim and Caribbean countries, which had proportionately larger populations of African slaves and their descendants, states were more likely to include questions about race or color across multiple censuses, and to retain them into the second half of the 20th century. The association between region demographic history and the inclusion of race or color questions on censuses was not perfect. Within each region and across different historical periods, there were exceptions to the general rule. Ethno-racial demography was not determinative of census categories, but it was not irrelevant to them either. The comparative overview provided makes it possible to identify anomalous cases within regions, raising a number of previously unexplored questions about the comparative history of ethno-racial classification in Latin America. Venezuela stands out as a puzzling case. Among countries with a significant history of African slavery, Venezuela is unique in its consistent abstention from including race or color questions in the national census. With respect to the visibility of Afro-descendant populations, Venezuela's censuses look surprisingly more like Argentina's and Brazil's. Why would this be the case? The Venezuelan historiography provides clues, but not a definitive answer. As noted in Chapter 5, the historian José Gil Fortual speculated in 1896 that Venezuela's national census purposefully omitted racial categories because elites did not want to remain blacks and their descendants of the painful experiences of slavery. Fortual determined the omission appropriate because intermixtures between whites, Indians, blacks, and mestizos meant that concerns about color no longer have such a notable influence in social life, and even less in political life, where it is not rare to see the highest government positions occupied by people of color who, it should be said in passing, do not show themselves to be inferior to white of pure race with respect to capacity to govern. In subsequent decades, the notion that miscegenation had rendered racial distinctions in Venezuelan society and politically inconsequential became official dogma. Nationalist projects envisioned Venezuela as a racial democracy composed of thoroughly racially mixed people, a café con leche nation. The official line found support in social, scientific, and historical work that claimed miscegenation had been more extensive in Venezuela than elsewhere in the region, and that as a result, people of color had faced fewer barriers to political and social inclusion, and no longer saw themselves as racially distinct. In the absence of official racial statistics throughout the 19th and 20th century, meanwhile, ensured that racial distinction and inequality remained statistically imperceptible, contributing the resilience of Venezuela's racial democracy myth. Yet the Brazilian case challenges the argument that extensive miscegenation coupled with an official national ideology of racial democracy suffices to explain the historical omission of race questions in the census. As in Venezuela, the notion that the population was thoroughly mixed and thus did not discriminate based on race was central to Brazilian nationalist lore. Instead of abstaining entirely from official racial classification on the census, Brazil's 19th and early 20th century agency produced racial statistics precisely to document extensive miscegenation and the demographic whitening of the population. Comparison of Venezuela and Brazil underscores that neither ethno-racial demography nor national ideology directly determines how states classify their population on the census. The inclusion or exclusion of a race question from any given national census ultimately hinges on politics. This includes proximate struggles among scientists, political elites, and, in some contexts, domestic activists. It also includes the relative position of domestic actors within broader national and international political and scientific fields that bear on census politics. The role of politics in shaping how states classify citizens on the census is especially clear in two principal anomalous cases in the post-World War II period, Brazil and Cuba. These are the only two Latin American countries that continue to include a direct question about race or color on national censuses throughout the second half of the 20th century, with the exception of 1970 in Brazil. Why did Brazil and Cuba retain these questions on their national censuses after the rest of the region, other than the United States, had retired them? Brazil's continued use of race or color questions on national censuses in the decades after World War II is particularly curious. The international scientific and moral momentum weighed against retaining a direct race question on the census, and the Venezuelan model of pronouncing such a question superfluous in a supposed racial democracy was readily available. More than once during these decades, critics called into question the scientific validity and purpose of the color, or query, nearly leading to its removal from the national census. Critics often not only pointed to technical and technological misgivings, they also questioned the relevance to the data it generated for a society where racial distinctions supposedly did not matter since everyone was mixed. Yet arguments in favor of continuity in the census prevailed, and the color question remained in the national consensuses in the 1940s through 1960s, and again from the 1980s through the 2010s. In the 1970 census rounds, opponents of color classification on the census temporarily won the day. Brazil's democratically elected government was toppled by a military coup in 1964. The ensuing years witnessed severe repression of political opponents and concerted efforts to stifle dissent. Among the activities the military regime deemed subversive were efforts by academics and activists to draw attention to racial inequality in Brazilian society. In a move that both reflected and reinforced the dictatorship's insistence that Brazilian society was a racial democracy, the color question was removed from the 1970 census. As in Venezuela, the claim that race was not relevant to understanding Brazilian society justified the omission of a census question that could have generated data that proved otherwise. In the lead-up to the 1980 census round, activists and sympathetic academics redoubled efforts to dispel the myth of racial democracy through a variety of means. Central to their efforts, they successfully lobbied the director of Brazil's Statistics Agency to reinsert a color-race query on the 1980 census. As suggested by political scientist Melissa Nobles, absent the organized pressure from academics and activists, Brazil's 1980 census would have been fielded without a color question, and Brazil would not show up as one of two outliers in the 1980s column. The targeting of Brazil's census agency by activists concerned with racial inequality sets an example that would be followed by several other countries in the 1990s and 2000s. The critical role of politics in shaping racial classifications on national censuses also helps explain the outlying case with respect to the visibility of Afro-descendant populations on national censuses in the latter part of the 20th century. Cuba is the only Latin American country to retain a color question in each national census through the second half of the 20th century. Indeed, Cuba stands out as the only Latin American country that has never taken a national census without such a question. Cuba's 20th century census-taking history was profoundly shaped by its peculiar relationship to the United States. Cuba's first official national census, taken in 1899, was actually conducted by the U.S. War Department. Prior to this, Cuba's censuses were colonial censuses taken by Spain. When Cuba became independent from Spain in 1998 and took charge with its own national censuses, it could have seized the opportunity to break with both the Spanish colonial and U.S. traditional official racial classification of its citizens. Finding inspiration in the writings of Cuba's nationalist hero, Jose Marti, census officials might have declared racial statistics irrelevant for understanding the raceless Cuban nation. But this path was not taken. Instead, Cuba's early 20th century census officials collected and analyzed racial statistics with greater scrutiny than anywhere else in Latin America. Like their counterparts in several other countries in the region, Cuban census officials used racial statistics to document progress towards whitening and civilizing of their population. The continued inclusion of color questions on Cuban censuses after the Revolution of 1959 is striking. In his first speech after taking power in January 1959, Fidel Castro brought the issue of racial inequality in Cuba into the spotlight. Among the most immediate tasks the provincial government identified was a real and effective policy against racial discrimination. In a speech of March 1959, a mere 2 months later, Castro named the elimination of racial discrimination as one of the 4 main aims of the revolution. One of the most just battles that must be fought, a battle that must be emphasized more and more, is the battle to end racial discrimination at work centers. It was not long, however, before Castro declared the revolutionary reform successful and the issue resolved. Efforts to draw further attention to the matters were repressed. Yet, unlike Brazil's military regime, which pronounced the racially egalitarian nature of Brazilian society with equal confidence, and invoked it as justification for removing race from the census in 1970, in Castro's Cuba, the collection of racial statistics and national censuses continued without interruption. Removing the color question from the census might have helped to enforce silence on racial matters on the island, but it would have also deprived the Castro regime of a valuable source of political ammunition in its ongoing ideological battles against the United States. The continued production of racial statistics made it possible to demonstrate, with the apparent objectivity of statistics, just how well the revolution had fared in its project to eradicate racial inequality. Statistical tables show the near absence of racial disparities in literacy, educational outcomes, and life expectancy, in sharp contrast to analogous statistical tables from the United States. This continuous collection of racial statistics in Cuba provided the regime a legitimate and scientific means to track its progress on an essential revolutionary goal. At the same time, the numbers also happened to hit the Achilles heel of the United States in the field of international moral politics after World War II, its foundational hypocrisy and enduring realm of systemic racial inequality. While contingencies of domestic and international politics led Brazil and Cuba retain questions about race or color on their national censuses, in the decades after World War II, the majority of Latin American countries, the presence and condition of Afro-descendant people became impossible to discern from national censuses in this period. The removal of race queries from censuses formed effectively disappeared Afro-Latin Americans from official demographic portraits of most countries in the region. The substitution of queries about cultural characteristics ended up highlighting indigenous diversity in several countries. It did not do the same for those of African origins. In most countries in the region, the shift from race to culture as a master category for tracking diversity within the nation brought increased attention to indigenous populations while eclipsing Afro-descendants from view.